Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. If you're a reader of my polling newsletter, The Week in Polls, you may have seen me often cite fascinating analysis of what makes people switch their views on issues or between parties from Steve Akehurst. So I'm delighted to be joined this time by the man himself. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Mark. Great to be here.
Now, for many listeners, even if they've maybe come across your work, maybe some of the references I've made to it or elsewhere, you're probably, if you don't mind me saying so, not that familiar a name to them. So before we get to your research, let's start with a simple question. Who are you, Steve?
Yeah, good question. One I ask myself. So I'm sometimes described as a pollster, but I have to be really careful about that because actual pollsters get quite sniffy about that. So I'm not technically a pollster. I probably best described as a polling analyst. So professionally, I do a lot of polling for progressive causes, polling in the context of campaigns, communications, that kind of thing. And yeah, I had the dubious honor a couple of years ago of coining the phrase blue wall. So I
Mm.
had a hand in all of those Ed Davey photo ops that everybody loves a little bit. But
Oh, I think there's someone in the Lib Dem press office who might
oh,
want
really?
to duke it out with you for that
Interesting.
that claim.
Interesting.
But
Okay, fine. Happy to have that debate. But anyway, yeah. More importantly, having done some of that stuff, kind of, personally for a bit last year, I started up a kind of small non-profit organization called Persuasion UK. So we do lots of deep dives on public attitudes on different thorny topics. And also, yeah, look at the way that the electorate's changing, basically, which maybe we'll get into here. But yeah, basically, I'm a polling analyst of some description.
yeah, absolutely. And a very good one as well. And I will include in the show notes for listeners links to Steve's work and his excellent email newsletter, which I would encourage everyone to sign up to. But I guess thinking about the current polling landscape, Steve, since the general election, the really big changes have been the fall in the Labour vote and the rise in the Reform vote. Now, of course, there's much more to that story than simply people switching from Labour to Reform, but that seems to be the switch that Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney are particularly focused on. So why don't we start with that? Because I know you've done some very interesting research into, I think, what you called Reform Curious 2024 Labour voters. So what do we know about those Reform Curious people who voted Starmer in 24 but are now flirting with Farage?
Yeah, so yeah, I think there's a broad pool of about 11% of the Labour 2024 vote that, yeah, voted Labour, but is kind of open to voting Reform. There's an interesting dynamic here between where that percentage varies a bit between pollsters, and maybe we can get into that. There's an interesting kind of house effect depending on what pollster you use, but generally I'd say it's about 11% of the Labour vote that's open to voting Reform in one form or another. A lot of those have already gone to Reform and some of them haven't. They're relatively small, as the numbers suggest, but obviously increasingly important given Reform are becoming or potentially going to be the main challenger to Labour in lots of seats. They count double, right? So that's one of the reasons they're obsessed with them. Who are they? Well, they're actually a really interesting group in a way. Like they're demographically similar to the core reform vote. So, they're more or less in that set demographically what the media narrative would suggest. They're more likely to be non-graduates, they're
Mm.
older, they're more working class. They're a little bit more likely to be social renters than the average reform voter, which is kind of interesting. But otherwise, demographically, they look more or less as you would expect them look, yeah, older. Yeah, have those characteristics that you would expect of a typical reform voter. But like attitudinally, they're a bit different, which is kind of interesting. And we'll get into this. Like they're distinct from the wider reform vote in a couple of interesting ways. What they share with the wider reform vote is a kind of like, a kind of social conservatism, basically. And that's what marks them out from the rest of the Labour vote. So they are more socially conservative on immigration and things like that. But they are more economically left wing than a lot of the reform vote. So this is essentially a kind of yeah, socially conservative, economically left wing bit of the Labour vote. Now, it's not as in, I think, it's would say it's not as intensely socially conservative as the wider reform vote. It's not into the kind of full suite of kind of reform
Mm.
pub chat grievances, but it is, particularly on migration and anti-politics. That those are the things that draw it to reform. But yeah, they differ to the reform vote slightly, and they have similarities there. But they have similarities with the rest of the Labour vote, but they have distinction. There's many things that makes them different to the rest of the Labour vote, and that is partly what makes them challenging for Labour in terms of balancing those voters with the rest of their coalition, and maybe we'll get into some of that.
Yeah. And one thing that particularly struck me about that group of sort of left on the economic issues, right on social liberal type issues is that is a group of people that there's a very long tradition of in the Labour Party. I mean, for a variety of reasons, I've been spending more time than I expected reading about the politics of the 1970s recently, including partly because of the tragic death this week of David Lipsey, who,
Mm.
chaired the House of Lords inquiry into opinion polls a few years ago. And, I think if I remember rightly, he actually first coined or came up with the relevance of the phrase winter of discontent. He also coined the phrase New Labour. So major political figure in many ways. But in the 1970s, I mean, you think Jim Callaghan as Labour Prime Minister, he was against many of the social liberalising reforms that Roy Jenkins previously had introduced as Home Secretary, but certainly not. I mean, although in the Labour scale, one might classify Jim Callaghan as being on the right of the Labour Party compared to, say, Tony Benn of the time. He was certainly not right wing in the way that, say, Mrs. Thatcher was right wing on the economy. So that sort of socially conservative but left on the economy group has been a long traditional part of the Labour Party. And I guess this is what slightly puzzles me at the way that the Labour at the moment, that's sort of Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer approach, almost seems to be treating these people as somehow a new difficult problem as opposed to a part of the Labour coalition that they're used to. So is there any way in which you think this is really a new problem rather than just a long-standing part of the challenge that any successful party faces of having several elements in a coalition
Yeah.
that you put together?
I don't think so in short, no, I don't think there's anything like super new to it. And in one way, what you can see this group as part of, if you want, you can put them in the lineage of the way that social democratic votes are changing generally, right? And this is, if you look at there used to be many more of these kind of voters. It's true inside the Labour coalition. Basically, the Labour coalition is kind of becoming more graduate, more left liberal over time. And again, we can get into some of the myths around the election last year and people saying that changed, but actually it didn't much. Like the social democratic coalitions are becoming more university educated and more left liberal and slightly, and changing in class composition. So, and that's a long running trend. And to some extent, then, yeah, this group is part of that chat. Is in that lineage. Yeah, it's part of a long running challenge. So no, I don't think the phenomenon itself is new. I mean, obviously Brexit sped up the process of some of these voters leaving Labour as well. I think it's important to say that the slight nuance here that like the core of the reform vote is like historically an anti-Labour vote. It's historically kind of come from the Conservatives and from the right. So this aspect of like that goes to Labour to reform is fairly new, right? So like historically, core reform voters are not kind of ex-Labour voters. This element in this parliament where some of them are going to reform, that aspect is new. But the idea of these voters leaving Labour is not new. I mean, they did that to the Conservative Party, for example, or to UKIP previously, or have gone to non-voting. So to answer your question, no, it's not like the broad trend and the broad challenge of keeping these voters inside the Labour tent is not new, but some of the kind of context and the dynamics in this parliament are a bit different.
Yeah, you bring back to me memories of those many arguments during UKIP's rise as to whether it was harming Tories or Labour more. And
Yeah,
as I recall, I think one of the distinguishing features then was that if you looked at the sort of which party UKIP voters had previously voted for,
yeah,
UKIP was taking a fair chunk of votes actually from Labour, but those were the sorts of votes that you would have expected otherwise a resurgent Conservative opposition party to be taking off Labour.
right.
And in a sense,
Yeah,
UKIP was therefore superficially damaging Labour, but really damaging the Tories because it was taking the votes that the Tories should have been winning over to recover. And I wonder if we should view in part that pattern from the past as being the way to think about what's happening at the moment, that the sort of voters that reform is peeling off Labour are the sorts of voters that a more successful Conservative opposition party would be
yeah.
picking up instead. And therefore, perhaps the real loser in all of this is the Tory party. The Labour Party has hit midterm unpopularity remarkably quickly for a government in many ways. But fundamentally, the fact that it's losing support in such a fractured way is perhaps rather better for it than if it was simply the old school traditional lose most of your support to the main opposition party.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, it's definitely true if you look at the composition of the Reform vote at the moment. Like people look at Reform going up and Labour going down and saying, oh, there must be lots of transfer going on, and well, not, they must be crushing the Labour vote. And actually, it's just much more complicated than that. I mean, Labour are losing votes in all kinds of different directions, and obviously, I'm not here to say the Labour to Reform thing doesn't matter, but it's only one part of the picture. Actually, Labour's fracturing votes in different places. But you can see quite clearly on the right of British politics that what is new in this parliament and what is happening that didn't happen with UKIP is that Reform is starting to become the main party on the right. Right? They're starting to consolidate the anti-Labour vote, and the anti-Labour vote that has never voted Labour or would not consider voting Labour, that is, may have been Conservative or even not voting. They're starting to, they have really added a lot of Conservative votes of the Conservative 2024 vote. They've added a lot since the general election. That's a big part of why they're up in the polls. They've also added a lot of non-voters, and some of those, about half of those non-voters were 2019 Conservative votes. So yeah, there is no doubt, Reform pose a threat to Labour in terms of them winning seats. But the main way they will win seats is essentially the main way Reform will win seats off Labour is essentially by consolidating the anti-Labour vote, and with the Labour vote fracturing. So it's not the first time in this conversation I'll say it's all quite messy and all quite complicated. And that's true about the Reform Curious Labour vote. It's true about the Labour vote generally. It's true about what's happening on the right. So we have very, very complex electoral politics inside a very crude two-party system. It creates lots of weird things. But yeah, you really have to look under the bonnet to know what's going on. So the Reform definitely pose a threat to Labour in terms of winning seats, but it's not primarily by winning their votes.
And that messiness is nicely illustrated by the fact that we're recording this the day after there was a council by-election in County Durham, where in the May elections, Reform came from nowhere to take the seat off Labour. The Reform councillor then turned out to be disqualified because he worked for the council. So there's just been a by-election held. And then the Lib Dems came from a long way back to win the seat, with Reform slipping into third. And, I think the politics of County Durham really encapsulate that messiness, because there is clearly a strong anti-Reform vote, but there's also a strong anti-Labour vote. And, that's why Labour had done particularly badly in the previous round of local elections there prior to this year. And so you could see in that by-election that essentially those two different narratives sort of duking it out, and the Lib Dems managing to win in part by being both the option for the anti-Labour voters and the option for the anti-Reform voters. Right. Of course, the risk is that you can end up being pulled apart by being seen as neither. This time it absolutely came off for the Lib Dems, but I think it's not a straightforward act to pull off. But I before we get on to this question about who else Labour has lost, because interestingly, you refer to these Reform curious people as being 11% of the 2024 Labour voters, which is quite a significant chunk, but that still leaves another 89% of people to talk about. But before we get into that, you mentioned house effects amongst pollsters, which caught my ear, because I think this is rather under talked about at the moment, the fact that there are some systematic differences between pollsters. The thing that particularly interests me is that if you look at the gap between the Conservatives and the Lib Dems in the polls, three pollsters, Techne, Find Out Now, and YouGov, consistently have the gap a tiny handful of points, 1, 2, 3 points very often. In fact, tied in at least a couple of polls, if I remember rightly. And then other pollsters have a much bigger gap. And particularly the combination of Find Out Now and YouGov is interesting to find them both on the same side, because YouGov were particularly good in 2024 at understanding the Lib Dem vote. Find Out Now for quite a while have been a bit of an outlier on the level of Reform vote. So you wouldn't necessarily bracket them together as being, expecting them to have a picture different from everyone else. But I presume it's probably a different aspect of how pollsters vary that you had in mind when you talked about house effects.
Yes, but actually shockingly similar patterns to what you've described.
Oh,
right?
Interesting.
So I don't know. I guess your audience is here for the getting into the weeds of this, but so
absolutely, head straight to the weeds, please.
Let's just do it. So yeah, I think there's basically a sort of spectrum on where the Labour vote is going and the nature of the Labour vote. And actually it is, I mean, it's interesting to pick it apart, but it is slightly alarming, I would say, in terms of the differences. So yeah, I would say broadly you have on one side of the spectrum, actually the same pair of pollsters you've just described, which is YouGov and Find Out Now, that very largely have the Labour vote going more to left parties, let's say, for which just colloquially I would bracket the Lib Dem and the Greens and Plaid and SNP. They have more going in that direction than they would do to Reform or to the Conservatives, quite a lot more. So that's both, although we see the same thing where Reform, Find Out Now and YouGov are basically in the same place on that, which again is unusual because Find Out Now also used to be quite distinct from YouGov on that. But so they've become quite similar. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you probably have a pollster, let's say, like Focal Data, for example, or Opinion, and they have basically have more voters going to Labour's right. They have more voters going to Reform and the Conservatives than they do to the small parties. And then somewhere in the middle, you have, for example, like More in Common, and I think Ipsos recently. So there's a real kind of spectrum, and it's a bit alarming. And I've tested this recently. You can, and it doesn't just impact voting intention; it influences issue polling as well. So I do a lot of polling on climate, and if you ask a polling question on climate to Labour voters in Opinion, you'll get a fairly markedly different response than you will do with YouGov. I mean, like, yeah, not massive, but notable, right? And now I'm not here to say who's right because like I don't know, but I do know that there's a broad spread, right, of like what is happening to the Labour vote and the nature and the composition of the Labour 2024 vote. And it seems to me I mean, obviously everyone in the industry will say, well, our panel is right and the others are wrong, especially because I'm a client. But I think, putting that aside, I think it would be really useful if the industry could get together and work out what's going on here, because yeah, otherwise it's got the makings of like at the very least misunderstanding what's going on, and at the worst an outright polling error at some point. So yeah, there's definitely house effects here. I use YouGov in a lot of the research, and I think they've got a really good reputation. So I completely, back them and in terms of the research that I've done. But of course, you have to acknowledge that there's a wide variety of pollsters offering or showing slightly different things at the moment, and it's important for us to kind of think about that when we're thinking about this conversation about the different directions that Labour's losing votes and what it does about it.
Yeah. And I think, as you say, I think YouGov have got one of the longest running and sort of best reputations of the pollster. Find Out Now is one of the new kids on the block. And I know folk from Find Out Now do sometimes listen to this podcast. I hope they don't mind if I say their reputation is a bit more debated, particularly when they were being a significant outlier on the level of the reform vote. So it is intriguing that YouGov and Find Out Now in particular are bracketed together in that. I mean, I think this does all illustrate the risks of polling averages, doesn't it? This is always a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, is polling averages do have a value, absolutely. But the problem with averaging together pollsters who are painting fundamentally different pictures is you're assuming, therefore, that the truth is going to be somewhere between the two, rather than one of those pictures is going to be right and the other is going to be wrong. And it seems to me it's possible that purely by chance, averaging out the different pollsters, whether they're showing Labour predominantly losing votes to the Liberals and left or to the right, might turn out to be where the truth lies, but it's more plausible, or at least as plausible, that it's one of those stories is right and the other is wrong, and we just don't know. We don't know which. I mean, I should perhaps say as well, this is not that unusual to have consistent differences amongst pollsters. I mean, one of the still mysteries of the 2024 general election is, did the Lib Dems do better or worse as voters got older? So, as you look through the age bands, does Lib Dem support go up or go down? You've got reputable pollsters who will tell you it went up. You've got reputable pollsters who tell you it went down. You've got reputable pollsters who will tell you there was no real age variation in the Lib Dem vote. Hopefully, the British election study will give us some data that will be the referee on that, because of the very high quality of the BES study, and particularly the way they match up their polling with the marked register to check they're actually getting the views of people who voted. But it is nonetheless an intriguing mystery. And so that does perhaps make it a little bit hard for you to answer my next question, which is, Labour has lost more than just support to reform since the general election, maybe unknown in what the relative quantities are. But what else is going on then, other than that Labour reform dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot. So again, depending on what polls to use, but let's just for the sake of argument, take the averages at the moment. Yeah, it's losing it's losing at least as much to the Lib Dems and the Greens at the moment. And particularly with YouGov, you see a very large switch from Labour to the Lib Dems. And some of that could be what gets called tactical unwind, but some of it also looks to be a bit beyond that. So yeah, I mean, certainly in the research I've done through YouGov, there's at least 2 or 3 times as many people switching from Labour to the Lib Dems and the Greens as they are to Reform. And actually, if you look at, and the crucial thing, and I think this is actually this goes beyond provider effects. This is true. The ceiling on defections to the left is higher. So like as we've talked about, 11% of the Labour vote is curious about Reform, 11 to 15% depending on what pollster you use. It's about half of that's already gone. But I would say there's not that much left in terms of what can go from Labour to Reform. But in terms of what is left that could go from Labour to the Lib Dems or the Greens, theoretically at least, the ceiling is much higher. There's about 39% of the Labour vote that says it would be open to voting Green or Lib Dem. Now, I'm not saying that will definitely happen for a whole bunch of reasons, but you can see the vulnerability in terms of defections to the left is much higher. And again, this is to do with the nature of the way I think that the Labour vote has changed, that people don't often acknowledge enough. There is, and I'm very much a follower of Rob Ford's work and Paula Surridge and others that talk about the key role of education in understanding British politics and British electorates. The Labour vote has become more graduate, it's become slightly younger, it's become slightly more urban. That is the Labour base now. And yeah, when those people get disillusioned, they tend to go looking for an alternative among kind of left bloc parties, basically Greens or the Lib Dems or applied to the SNP. And I say there is a regional dimension to this as well. So nationally, this doesn't show up much. But if you look at the polling in Wales, for example, I mean, I think pollsters are fairly consistent on this, actually. Like Labour is hemorrhaging a huge amount of votes to Plaid, right? That's one of the reasons that Labour is down in the Senedd polling and in the Westminster polling there. So basically, under the surface, and in Scotland, the loss to the SNP is a bit lower. Actually, the loss to Reform in Scotland is actually higher than elsewhere in the country, which is an interesting wrinkle we can get into if you want. But yeah, basically, what is happening under the surface is, at the moment at least, Labour is losing a lot of votes to. I think it's fairly clear Labour's losing as much, if not more, probably votes to the Greens and the Lib Dems than they are to Reform and the Conservative Party. Now, this is a good example of where data can tell you one thing, but not necessarily what to do about it. Okay, and there's then different views about about how seriously to take that. So if you are sort of on the right of the Labour Party, you'll say, and I know because I've heard this back, yeah, well, Steve, in the end, all these people that are going to the Lib Dems and the Greens, they're going to come back, aren't they? Like they're just they're using a poll in the middle of a parliament to protest. We'll put the squeeze on them and they'll come back. And I can't say that's not true. Maybe that's true, but I think it's a definite kind of known unknown about whether that's true and to what extent these voters are just kind of disillusioned Labour base voters and to what extent actually they're far more transactional than that. And I think Labour's got kind of, the interaction between the Labour and the Lib Dem vote at the last election was an absolutely massive part of understanding the result, right? It's a kind of the Labour vote and the Lib Dem vote, I think, is nationally becoming slightly indistinguishable in terms of demographics and attitudes. It's a love that dare not speak its name. So, like, whether it can be efficient in the same way again is a massive part of the next election. But if Labour does start to lose kind of lots of votes to the Lib Dems in places where it's fighting the Tories, then it's in real trouble, right? So a massive kind of question is like whether it can get those voters back. And whether they come back naturally or whether they need to be wooed, as a swing group, or whether you take the view that actually, yeah, they're going to come back anyway. So just focus on the reform Labour group, and that I
Yeah.
think is a live debate going on in Labour world, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, and I think there are two aspects to that, aren't there? There's sort of the tactical voting aspect and the geography aspect.
Right.
And so, in say, well, actually, I live in Jeremy Corbyn's constituency, but let's take the next door constituency to where I live then. So Islington South, Labour held seat, very large majority, full all-out council elections next May. If you look at the current state of the polls, certainly local Lib Dems, optimistic that we might have a decent chance of getting some councillors on the council once again. Possibilities that perhaps Green or Splinter Left Party also make some gains against Labour in Islington South. But if you're taking that sort of Labour right, so on the right of Labour, that point of view that you were setting out, Steve, I think you could, you wouldn't have to be too complacent to say, yeah, okay, we might have some tough times in the council elections, but come on, surely, do you really think any of those parties are going to threaten us at the general election? To which, obviously, of course, the correct answer I have to give as president of the Liberal Democrats is yes, absolutely, we will be breathing down your necks. But you can see why somebody on the Labour right might think, yeah, we'll have a few embarrassments, perhaps, at various local elections, but fundamentally it'll come right come the general election for a sort of tactical voting sort of perspective. But also there's the geography, which is that fundamentally the places where Labour is most vulnerable to losing votes, particularly to Lib Dems and Greens, seem to be generally areas where Labour's majorities were biggest at the general election and are not the Labour sort of reform or Labour Tory battlegrounds. And therefore, again, it might be, well, okay, maybe we'll lose some support, but we won't be losing it in the places that matter most. And I guess in that sense, the 2005 general election is quite an interesting template because this was Tony Blair's third general election victory, a surprisingly small margin of victory, I guess, in some ways, once all the dust was settled and the numbers were counted up. But it was a very clear victory. It was the third in a row. And yet, and despite all of the Iraq war, etc., resulting in definitely Lib Dem and Labour being at real loggerheads in many places, Lib Dems making some gains from Labour, fundamentally the anti-Tory tactical voting still worked for Labour where Labour needed it, and it still worked for the Lib Dems where we needed it. And so, anti-Tory tactical voting can carry on working long after the Tories have been out of power. And I think that, in as much as history is a guide, I can at least see why some in Labour might be, being relatively relaxed about losing votes to Lib Dems and Greens. Obviously, there's a counterpoint, particularly about, given how much better the Lib Dems are doing now than we were a few years ago, and actually just how far can we challenge Labour. But I mean, if you had to bet, how would you say it's a complacent or it's a sort of wisely sagacious view that those on the Labour right take about being relaxed on this?
So I start from a point of view as I understand both sides of the argument. I'm not going to fudge this completely, I promise, but I understand both sides of the argument, and I think it's made in good faith, right? So I don't think I think you can legitimately reach different views based on the existing numbers. I err slightly more towards the argument that it's a bit complacent to assume they'll come back, or indeed to not take it seriously for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the idea that all of this vote is just in kind of safe seats is I know is not completely true, which is to say the Labour Party won on 33% of the vote, right? So it has a highly efficient victory. There aren't that many safe Labour seats anymore as a result. So that's the first thing. The Greens, or like a very well organised kind of left alternative, could beat Labour in like quite a decent number of areas, I would say, depending if they get their act together. Maybe not the Lib Dems, but certainly the Greens or some constellation of that in certain areas. So they could lose some. I'm not loads, but they could lose, I'd say, 50 or 60 seats directly if it went really badly. But more importantly, obviously, it's about what happens in those Labour reform or Labour Tory battlegrounds, as you suggest, right? That's really where the next election is going to be. And yeah, I think it's a reasonable assumption to say, that Labour could squeeze those people back, like into basically if the next election essentially, do you want Farage to be Prime Minister? But I think it would be wrong to assume it will happen naturally, which is to say, I think the party needs to treat these voters like a swing group rather than just a group that will naturally come back. Because if you look at a lot of them, for example, if you take the Labour to Lib Dem defector group, they're not necessarily solid Labour voters. If you look, they've got a history of at the 2019 election, Labour lost a lot of votes to the Lib Dems, and that was the squeeze message didn't work there because like Corbyn had alienated these voters so much. So like they are not. One thing I do think it's a bit complacent to just say, yeah, these people will come back naturally because we're not Farage, and therefore we can spend the next 2 or 3 years kind of just basically, just looking after that one voter group. I think, Labour has to find a way of and find a pitch and a governing program and all of that kind of stuff that is, it can upset these kind of Labour to Lib Dem, Labour to Green type defectors on some issues, but I don't think it can make a habit out of like trolling them, basically, which is why I think that sometimes there's a view that they kind of can because they're going to come back anyway. So yeah, if you had to force me one way or the other, I would lean more towards saying, no, you have to take it seriously. Obviously, then you don't want to go off too far in the other direction. And that's the difficult balance. That's the difficult nature of trying to balance the kind of left bit of the Labour vote with the right bit of the Labour vote, and the left swing group and the right swing group. But I think, a crucial thing is I do think you need to treat this group like a swing group rather than just a group that's a bit grumpy and will come back naturally.
And I think from the Lib Dem perspective, I think the other reason why Labour might, it might turn out Labour as being a little bit complacent, and is a factor that you can't capture in the polls or the focus groups at all, really. But I think it's the quality of the Lib Dem activists in these sorts of areas.
Yeah.
But almost by definition, if there is a bit of a Lib Dem local government presence and a bit of bit of Lib Dem organisation on the ground
Mm.
in some of these nominally previously very large Labour majority seats, those teams are very good because they've survived through some really
Yeah.
difficult political years, and therefore their ability to grow very quickly in the right political circumstances is
Yeah.
definitely there. And in a way, this is part of what we saw for the Lib Dems in the 2024 election in Tory-facing areas, is a definite decent handful of places where there was a very good team that in those circumstances was then able to grow remarkably quickly and remarkably successfully. And so I think there is a certain risk there built in that a poll is never gonna pick up.
Yeah.
I guess you could try asking voters, what do you think of the quality of the artwork and the artwork design of the last leaflet you received? But good luck trying to divine quality of organisation that way. But one group we've not talked about, I think we've only briefly mentioned so far, are the don't knows. And during the last Parliament, the number of people who had switched from Tory to don't know was partly an explanation for how different pollsters had different numbers because they treated the don't knows in different ways. It was also a perennial source of political hope for the Tories.
Yeah.
It was also similarly actually for the Lib Dems in 2010 to 15. I made an appearance on the Today programme in about 2011, I think it was, talking up the Lib Dem chances of recovery because so many of the Lib Dems who had voted 2010 and were no longer backing the party had only switched to don't know. Listeners won't be able to see Steve quite rightly having a wry smile as I recount that, because of course that's not how it turned out, and nor indeed did the don't knows come to the Tories' rescue last time. So, but at this time, and again, as you said, Steve, it varies by pollster, there does seem to be a decent chunk of Labour to don't know. What's your take on how we should view that?
Yeah, this is like asking me about like what's my take on turnout. It's like one of the hardest questions in polling is what.
Oh, well, I'll do that next then, okay?
Yeah. What do you do with don't knows? How do you think about don't
Turn
know?
out amongst the don't knows, Steve.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like enough to give anyone who's even vaguely involved in polling a massive migraine because it's really difficult. People are annoying in terms of their future state, how predictable they are or not. So yeah, as you say, don't knows are the kind of a perennial kind of source of cope, I guess, as the kids would say, for political activists and politicos, right? Like, yeah, look at all these don't knows. So yeah, I think, and it is true, yeah, but it is nevertheless true that like at the moment there's a much higher proportion of the Labour vote that don't know than other parties. I think if you look back, that's probably fairly normal for incumbents, particularly incumbents that are struggling, basically, because a lot of politics is about energy, right? We saw this at the local elections. Like it's a lot about the enthusiasm and efficiency and yeah, energy in your block, let's say, and like the all of the energy and the enthusiasm moment is on the kind of yeah is on the right of British politics, or at least not on the Labour side. And so you do just get a lot of natural Labour supporters that, yeah, like they might not have switched, but they're more inclined to go, or I don't know. So then, yeah, what happens to those voters at election time is obviously a massive question. Like, I think our default should be just like to assume that they will fall in broadly the same way as the rest of the kind of Labour vote. Okay, that's probably a sensible like default assumption to make, and so therefore I don't think they can be like a massive source of hope for the party. The only thing I will say is this: when increasingly when I do surveys now, I'm not just asking about voting intention. I'm doing a squeeze question, which is all right, but imagine it's Labour or Reform in your area, or imagine it's Labour or the Tories, or imagine it's the Lib Dems or the Conservatives. Just trying to get at this, which is of course not perfect, but when you do those kind of squeeze questions, you will see that the Labour lead. Firstly, the Labour claw back a lot of ground over reform, and secondly, that a lot of I think about 60% of the don't knows do go back to Labour in that circumstance. Now, and very few of them actually do go to reform. The rest of them tend to just say, "Oh, well, I won't bother voting." So that does suggest that, like, again, if Labour can kind of plausibly, if the threat of reform and the threat of Farage is real in 2028, and Labour obviously has delivered some stuff and hasn't completely alienated like a large part of its vote, then I do think those don't knows are kind of, yeah, there is the potential there for them to disproportionately fall to Labour in like Labour versus reform kind of seats, and then so they could therefore be quite crucial. But obviously, there's just a long way to go, and there's just a whole bunch of ways in which that vote might just fall precisely the same way as everything else, and or just not vote. So yeah, there's it's
And I guess there's a third option coming back to the example of the County Durham by-election, where it had been a Labour-held seat that Reform took,
yeah,
and this time it was Lib Dems taking it off
right,
Reform. Is those Labour to don't knows may, when push comes to shove, be willing to vote Labour instead of Reform. But if they've got a credible Lib
right,
Dem or Corbynista or Green alternative, actually they may
yes,
pick that in instead, which should make us thankful for MRPs, I guess, in the run up to the next election,
yes,
because I think national voting intention polls will probably struggle to really give us the full picture about what's going on in a way that in lots of previous elections, the national voting, you look at the national voting intention polls, you basically have the picture. I think that's unlikely to be the case this time or next time around. But if coming back to the sort of challenge that Labour faces, because I know you did some interesting analysis about of the different things that people say might win them back to Labour. What's the simple, easy to implement plan that Labour should follow to win all these folk back?
thank God. Yeah, we're really on to the easy stuff here. I'm gonna stray into I can't remember. I think it was Rachel Wolf who said one of the most annoying things polling people can do is just walk into a politician's office and go, "Oh yeah, just fix the NHS and everything's fine." And I do worry that we're going to stray into that territory here. But I think there's three basic ways back. And again, like all of this is interpretation of the data rather than science, right? The data will not tell you this, but
Yeah,
it can suggest different ways through, and you can build different theories of it. And I think one of the problems for Labour right now actually is there's multiple different theories around Labour world as to how you fix this, and that's partly why you see a lot of some of the infighting. And actually, I think part of the identity crisis Starmer seems to be having in public at the moment, I think, is also kind of part of him having multiple different things in his head about how to answer your question here. In terms of my take on it, yeah, I think there's three main aspects, right? Like there's one what we could call there is a deliverism, there's an emotionalism, and then there's a reform squeeze, and I think those are the three key things. So like on the deliverism thing, again, I know this is really hard to say, really hard thing, easy thing to say and hard to do. But like if by 2028 there is like some noticeable improvement in the public realm, that will make a massive difference, right? The Labour Party was elected partly on an anti-Tory platform, true, but partly because of like just the way that the public services and the public realm generally has kind of degraded and fallen apart in this country. And so, if it has kind of made noticeable improvement on the NHS, or maybe on things like energy bills and cost of living, if that's at all possible, and generally there's a sense that things are just a bit less rubbish as a country, like that will help a lot. Okay, it's like it's not going to be everything though. Okay, and then there's the kind of reform squeeze question, which we've discussed, which I think like if making the threat of Farage Prime Minister real, and that being real in people's minds, I think is an important second part. I think there's a third aspect here, where this is where I would differ from a lot of polling analysts, right, who would just be solely about deliverism. I do think there is like an emotionalism aspect here, which is to say, I think issues matter. Like I'm a big believer in like issue salience being a massive part of part of elections. And I think right now the challenge Labour has is that a lot of the salient issues and a lot of the issues that get covered in politics are essentially issues that divide its coalition, right? Like they're cultural arguments about, and about migration, asylum, ECHR, I mean even welfare to some degree actually is kind of a cultural argument that's wrapped inside an economic one. And the salience of these issues like cause problems for Labour because they stretch its coalition very
mm,
far apart. Like those Green and Lib Dem curious voters find themselves in a very different place to the Reform curious voter. And so when these issues are salient, they cause a lot of problem for Labour. So I think it's also about the issue agenda. If the next election is about basically an Olympics on how much can you dislike immigration, then I think Labour's just like structurally at an advantage. If it can make the election more on those kind of economic kind of conflict issues, that is where reform is actually quite weak. And I don't necessarily just mean in terms of competence at managing budgets. I mean basically old-fashioned, traditional bread and butter left-right issues. I guess the NHS would be one, but there's also a bunch of other ones. So if you can make basically, if Labour can make the election about, many versus the few type stuff, and it's about those kind of economic conflicts with reform, then I think that's like an issue agenda that just benefits them much more than kind of an election on how do you deal with small boats, or how do you deal with like whatever cultural war topic is bubbling away. So I think, yeah, there's three aspects. There's deliverism, there's the squeeze message, and then, yeah, I do think there's this kind of it's about the issue agenda, and it's about like the conflicts within British politics, and the dividing lines that Labour pick with
Yeah.
reform are going to be absolutely essential, I think. And then, of course, lots of other things. There's a whole bunch of other parties, obviously, as well, that come into things and matter. But in terms of how they get back, I think that would be my best guess.
Yeah, I wrote a piece last week in which I sort of threw in the line that in a way Labour's challenge is a Michael Barber, not a Morgan McSweeney one, by which I mean not one about needing cunning political strategy, but Michael Barber was,
Yeah.
the sort of head of the sort of chief person for many of the Blair years at delivering improvements in public services. He's come back actually to advise the Starmer government, and actually if you want one of those two to really succeed in their role, the one that matters much more for Labour's political prospects, I think, is actually Michael Barber, not Morgan McSweeney, because they've got to get the basics right. And as you say,
Yeah.
it is so easy for a polling analyst or pollster to say, "Oh yeah, look, you've just got to fix the economy and get some money into public services." And then, but the other thing is, as you say, the government does have the power to some extent to set the political agenda. I'm always really skeptical about anyone outside government talking about trying to push an issue up the agenda, because I think there is vanishing little evidence that anyone other than the government or external events really move what issues matter most to the public. But the government does perhaps have some power, and I was particularly struck by the £2 billion in the spending review that were put into nuclear fusion, partly because just this is always the promised technology that is going to be amazing in 20 years' time. And it was 20 years away when I was a kid first hearing about it on Tomorrow's World. And it's still, but I also thought, just from a political point of view, you sort of think, if you have that £2 billion, why spend it on fusion rather than, let's say, tackling homelessness, which would absolutely tick the tackling poverty, dealing with causes that are dear to Labour members and parliamentarians and activists' heart, but also the rise in homelessness on the streets in urban areas is very much a very visible sign of that sense of, things have fallen apart, everything is broken, etc. So I think you could do an awful lot with £2 billion if you were to spend that on maybe tackling homelessness and tackling potholes. And if both of those were visibly better in a few years' time, and both actually are the sorts of issues that are very responsive to spending money on. If you want people to feel better. And I'm still puzzled. I'm also puzzled why nobody else seems to be puzzled as to why they found 2 billion for fusion of all things and not for other stuff. But do you, from the polling data, do you get any sense of why? Because it seems so obvious to say, well, Labour's just making a mistake. They are talking up issues on which they are divided and Reform is united, rather than talking up issues on which they are united and Reform is divided. But if we wanted to be more generous to Labour, can you see a logic in the polls as to why,
Yeah.
this approach might be the right one that they're
Oh,
taking?
you completely build a case. I mean, people that look at these things, McSweeney and they're not daft, right? I mean, they're
Mm,
looking at the same numbers as us, but they're just interpreting them in different ways. And I think that's an important thing to
mm,
to say. Like, all of these disagreements should be good faith, because you can find you could find justification for them. So the argument would go. So yeah, broadly, I bend toward to what you were saying there. But the argument on the other side of the ledger would be, well, firstly, you make it. You kind of, again, it comes back to this assumption that that some of the Lib Dem and the Green defector groups will come back anyway when Labour put the squeeze on them. So that's the first assumption that you can make to get to where Labour, to get to the kind of Labour, or the right of the Labour Party kind of view of the world. That's the first assumption. The second assumption is kind of to kind of, I guess, over-index on deliverism a bit, right? So it's a very deliverist view, which is say, look, these voters are the Labour to Reform voters are overwhelmingly the most important voters, right? So we have to completely tailor to we have to reflect their issue views. We have to reflect their issue priorities. They're really angry about migration. They're really angry about small boats. And so, like, if you don't address this, you look like you're completely ignoring them. So in some sense, it's just old-fashioned responding to just responsive democracy kind of argument that you could make. And the electoral argument would be twofold. Is firstly, yeah, if you show you're fixing these issues, then like you'll get credit for the election. That would be their view. And the second assumption would be, well, okay, the one way to lower the salience of these issues is to sort of to take the heat out of them by fixing the underlying issue, or indeed by, in a classic social science sense, I guess, kind of limiting the space to which people see disagreement between the parties on these topics. So there's like these now we can get into why I think some of the risks around that, and some of the other arguments you can make about that. But basically, yeah, it's perfectly logical. If you assume that the only real vote that matters is this Labour to Reform vote, and you assume that they overwhelmingly care about these issues, then like in a sense, like it's kind of, yeah, it's a classic play to just try and move on to that turf and co-opt it, and sort of to limit the space to which people see massive disagreement between Labour and Reform on some of these topics.
Yeah. Well, the next few years will give us a pretty good clue as to which of those interpretations will turn out to be right. I guess there's always the possibility some major issue will come along which will upend the
Yeah.
political agenda, and therefore we will end up never knowing which of them is right. But in the meantime, as a lot of the listeners to this show are particularly interested in the Liberal Democrats, and we've only touched on them a bit,
Yeah.
why don't we end, Steve, with just a final thought, or maybe thoughts in plural from you, on any advice you'd have for Lib Dem campaigners based on the sorts of data you've been looking at?
It's interesting. Yeah, I feel it's a formidable task to give advice to the Lib Dems, just because I think they do such a good job in terms of the way that they operate, and I think Ed Davey is broadly doing the right stuff. Okay, I mean there's always a degree to which maybe they could be synonymous with a few more key issues. I mean, I know they've tried that on social care. Obviously, back in the day there was the famous 1% on income tax for XYZ. That was, so I do think there's still like a slightly kind of amorphous nature to the Lib Dem brand. It's not necessarily associated with any particular issues, but then at the same time, maybe that has an upside. I guess, yeah, my broad take is, look, the next election I think it does benefit basically the Lib Dems to have the next election as Labour, as basically, do you want Farage as Prime Minister? Right. So it's about stopping Farage as Prime Minister. So I do think I don't know if there's a debate about this within the Lib Dems generally, but I do think, yeah, if you had to choose, I would resist the temptation to kind of get really, really, far away from Labour necessarily, or kind of like basically do too much kind of repositioning of the Lib Dem brand. I think basically the Lib Dems being some think that like Labour voters in those Labour Conservative seats, so in those Lib Dem Conservative seats can still vote for, I think is a massive part. I think the level of tactical voting among like Labour 2019 voters for the Lib Dems in those kind of Lib Dem Tory seats is absolutely massive. I mean, when you look at it, it's astonishing. So I think broadly, basically keeping on side with those voters is going to be like an absolutely essential part of probably how the Lib Dems do at the next election, which I think they understand. So yeah, I would say, yeah, you need to keep enough distance from an unpopular government, but broadly, I would say the best place for the Lib Dems to be is like part of that anti-reform pact, basically, around the next election, and sort of being a place that yeah, Labour voters could still feel that they can vote for tactically, I think is massively important. Now, of course, Lib Dems have all the same dilemmas as the Labour in terms of how do you do that, but also, I don't know, keep the Lib Dem to Tory voters from on side without going to reform and all of that kind of stuff. But I do think, yeah, I think it's off. Maybe it's not neglected in Lib Dem world, but I do think it's neglected in the broader kind of Westminster world, which is like the essential nature of those Labour to Lib Dem switches in those kind of Lib Dem Tory seats, I think is absolutely essential, and like keeping those voters inside the tent instead of going off to the Greens or going to Labour or fracturing different directions. I think, yeah, it's massively important. So I would keep an eye on those voters in those seats, because yeah, I do have a feeling, yeah, it's basically the best play for Lib Dems in a sense is the best play for reform, which is like the next election being, do you want Farage as Prime Minister?
Yeah. I think in terms of holding on to those Labour tactical voters from the election, broadly, we do have two bonuses next time round. One is that it's likely Labour will be less popular than they were at the last election. Certainly they are at the moment. And also, in almost all of those seats, there is now an incumbent Lib Dem MP in the way there wasn't before.
Right.
And therefore, there's the ability for the MP to build up a personal vote to help solidify the support of those tactical voters, so that it's both a vote for the local MP that they really like, as well as a vote for the message from the bar charts. But I think broadly speaking, I think probably where we are at the moment is actually quite similar to what you described. If you look at the Lib Dem response to things like the spending review, it's been very much about saying, well, the government should be more ambitious, should sort of go further, should do more, as opposed to saying they're heading in completely the wrong direction. It's rather, you're going mostly in the right direction, but you're just not delivering nearly enough. And so, and on the NHS, it's great you're doing all this stuff for the NHS, but you really need to be fixing social care, as opposed to, some of the voices, at least from reform, which are not very positive about wanting a big, successful state-run health service. But we could digress into that an awful lot more. So probably better before we do, and I eat up the rest of your day, Steve, if we wrap it up at that point. So many, many thanks for your time. Listeners can find links to Steve's research and his excellent email newsletter in the show notes, and you can find him on Blue Sky at steveakehurst.bsky.social and myself at markpackuk.bsky.social. And if you like listening, please do tell others about this podcast and give it a rating or review in your favourite podcast app. Thank you, everyone, for listening.